SAP S/4HANA is one of the most common ERP systems in the marketplace, but there's a ton of reasons why you should not implement S/4HANA, and that's what I want to talk about here today. My name is Eric.Kimberling. I'm the CEO of Third Stage Consulting. We're an independent consulting firm that helps clients through their digital transformation journeys. And S/4HANA is one of the most common systems out there, especially for larger Fortune 1000 and large government organizations. SAP is somewhat of a gold standard for larger, more complex organizations. It's a fully integrated system that provides a lot of breadth of capability, and it really is scalable for the needs of larger organizations and more complex organizations. But there's a lot of risk that goes along with these sorts of transformations involving S/4HANA. And so what I want to talk about today are the reasons why you should consider not implementing S/4HANA and considering alternatives to S/4HANA, or at the very least, figuring out ways to mitigate the risks of an S/4HANA transformation. Now, one of the first reasons why you should consider not implementing S/4HANA is that the product is relatively new. And when I say relatively new, it's not new, but it hasn't been around as long as ECC and R3 and some of the other older legacy SAP products. And while the new technology of the HANA platform and some of the capabilities of S/4HANA are more advanced technologically, there's still a lot of functional capabilities that have not yet been baked into S/4HANA, but they're things that were common in ECC or R3. So while ECC and R3 had decades of R&D and development and improvements and enhancements over the years, S/4HANA is still relatively new in that regard, in that not all the capabilities of the older legacy SAP products have been built into S/4HANA. So at the very least, even if you do find that S/4HANA is the path you're going to go down and it's the best solution for you, you at the very least want to identify where the gaps are and where the deficiencies are so you can figure out how you're going to navigate those gaps, either through third-party bolt-on solutions or manual workarounds or some sort of change to your processes to adapt to whatever deficiencies might exist in the system. But either way, you want to go in with eyes wide open and be aware of these gaps and be aware of the fact that the product is less mature than some of the legacy products that SAP provides. Now, a lot of clients we work with find that S/4HANA is very difficult to maintain, or at the very least costly to maintain. And whereas some other products in the ERP software marketplace don't require as much heavy lifting in terms of IT support and ongoing maintenance, S/4HANA tends to require a lot more maintenance and support, not just during the implementation itself, but also post-implementation. So implementations technically take a small army of consultants to implement effectively within your organization just to get the software to work. And part of the reason for that is because it's such a broad and complex and diverse set of capabilities that need to be configured to fit each unique situation that it's deployed. In addition to the implementation cost of maintenance, there's also the post-implementation maintenance in terms of making sure that you have the IT resources and capabilities to be able to support the software going forward. And even if you're moving from an SAP environment to S/4HANA, it still requires an upskill in your resources to ensure you have the right capabilities. And certainly if you're making a leap from a different type of non-SAP product to S/4HANA, that gap or that jump from the old legacy environment to the new one can be even more extreme. So be prepared to invest in a small army of people to help you implement the solution and a small army of people to help you maintain the solution longer term, because that is the common scenario that we see with S/4HANA customers. Now, even though S/4HANA is not nearly as rigid and inflexible as some of the legacy SAP products, it is still relatively inflexible when you compare it to other solutions in the marketplace. And part of this is by design. That's one of the appeals or the strengths of the product, is that it provides a certain amount of standardization and scalability and repeatable processes that larger organizations tend to want. But along with that rigidity and that standardization comes a resistance to change and organizational change and people-related issues. So while the technology may work perfectly for you or may work very well for you, it's going to be very difficult for your people to adapt to the technology. So that's something to be aware of, is the most effective S/4HANA deployments out there invest extremely heavily in the organizational change management component of things. Another reason you should consider not implementing S/4HANA, or at the very least making big risk adjustments to your S/4HANA deployment, is the fact that the Activate methodology is largely incomplete. And it is presented as a sort of cookie cutter approach to how S4HANA gets deployed. But the reality is we find that it's simply a starting point for most organizations, and it needs to be heavily tailored for every unique situation. Now, in addition to needing to tailor the Activate methodology for unique organizations, there's also a lot of missing components of the Activate methodology. For example, the organizational change component that I just mentioned a moment ago is largely missing or incomplete in the Activate methodology. There's a lot more that organizations need to do from a change management perspective in order to be successful. Now, another deficiency, in my opinion, of the Activate methodology is the fact that it promotes the whole concept of Agile, which Agile in and of itself is not a bad thing necessarily. A lot of organizations benefit from agility and just Agile development methods. But when it comes to designing and developing and building an ERP system, especially for a global, larger, complex organization, waterfall methodologies that design all of your business processes and your target operating model up front prior to starting deployment can be very effective. And that's half the value of S4HANA, is the fact that it allows you to standardize and create a common operating model. Agile implementation methodologies, on the other hand, tend to pick off little bits and pieces of your organization and deploy technologies to those parts of the organization without necessarily considering the entire global blueprint for how the organization is going to look. So that's just another example of how the Activate methodology has some flaws, needs to be augmented, and in some cases retooled for your organization. So even if you do decide to implement S4HANA, be sure you really poke holes in that Activate methodology and tailor it for your needs and build it out to include those critical success factors that you'll need to be successful. Now, another reason you may want to consider other options besides S4HANA is that S4HANA can be overkill for a lot of organizations. Unless you're one of the largest organizations in the world or the most complex or diverse organizations in the world, there's going to be other solutions out there that might be lower cost for you, they might be more flexible, they might be more easily integrated. There's a lot of benefits to looking at other solutions, especially if you're a smaller, mid-size organization. And that can certainly save you time and money in terms of the deployment, and it can certainly mitigate your risk along the way. But if you do decide to move forward with an S4HANA implementation, you still want to rationalize and validate what exactly you're deploying and what exactly you're going to implement. We see a lot of organizations that bite off way more than they can chew, too many modules, too many bolt-ons from SAP, too many complexities that they don't necessarily need. So just make sure that you're really rationalizing the purchasing decision of what exactly you're getting and what exactly you're going to deploy, because we see it time and time again where most organizations buy more than they need. And it's always easier to add more capability later than it is to try and scale back or get out of the cost that you might have committed to longer term. SAP has spent the last several years going out and acquiring a lot of point solutions to augment the S4HANA offering. For example, they've acquired Ariba, which is a procurement and supply chain management type of software. They've acquired SuccessFactors, which is a human capital management solution. And they've also acquired Concur and Qualtrics as well as two other bolt-ons to their solution. Now, a lot of organizations go into their S4HANA deployments under the assumption or the default assumption that they're just going to implement these bolt-ons that SAP has acquired. And it's a good sales message because they have these bolt-ons that complete the offering of S4HANA in many cases. But the reality is that they're almost still like third-party systems. They still require a great deal of work to integrate. They're not as seamlessly integrated as SAP and their system integrators may indicate to you. So it really creates a lot of complexity and cost and risk that a lot of organizations aren't prepared for. And in many cases, as in the case of SuccessFactors and Ariba, for example, it can make more sense or just as much sense to go out and evaluate other human capital management or other procurement and supply chain systems if you need some sort of bolt-on to augment what S4HANA can and can't do in those areas. So just because SAP owns these solutions doesn't mean it's the best solution for you. It's important to keep an open mind and create a digital strategy and roadmap for your SAP and S4HANA deployment to fit the needs of your organization. Now, I mentioned earlier how S4HANA deployments require a small army of consultants to help deploy the system. And for many larger organizations, it's actually a large army of consultants required to deploy the system. And some of the larger system integrators are notorious for staffing these projects extremely heavily with a lot of different resources, both onshore and offshore, that you may or may not have transparency into what they're doing and what kind of value you're getting for the price tag you're paying for all of these resources. So because SAP system integrators tend to be one of the big guys like Accenture and Deloitte and Capgemini, KPMG, et cetera, they tend to have these big teams of consultants that can oftentimes steamroll the client organizations. And it's almost like a don't look behind the curtain Wizard of Oz type of thing where they're off creating the software and doing their own thing, but you don't really understand or have transparency into those workings and the business value that they're providing. So really making sure that you have the capabilities and the program management capabilities and just the general leadership within the organization to not only manage the system integrators and take control of the project, but to really set a clear vision for how you want this project to look and making sure that the system integrator falls into that vision rather than deferring everything to the system integrator, which is what many organizations fall into. Now, SAP is moving S/4HANA to more of a cloud and subscription-based model, just as most ERP vendors are, which entails higher costs, and it commits larger organizations to big price tags over the longer term. So that's one thing to keep in mind, is that you want to make sure you really understand what you're getting yourself into in terms of subscription costs, and if you're doing on-premise, the initial license costs and the ongoing maintenance that goes along with that. In addition to the initial subscription cost or the software costs themselves, you also have to look at the cost of implementation. Implementing SAP generally costs more than implementing other types of solutions. Not to say it's not necessarily worth it or that you won't get an ROI out of it, but the cost generally is higher. So if you're an extremely cost-sensitive organization, or if times are tough, or you've got very slim margins on your product or service that you're selling, you may want to consider lower cost options out there, and there are plenty of lower cost options out there in the marketplace. Arguably, the biggest challenge with S/4HANA deployments is the fact that the return on investment and the value is extremely difficult to realize. There certainly are organizations out there that are realizing the value, that have realized a positive ROI on their investments in S/4HANA, but unfortunately, those case studies are still few and far between. Too many organizations struggle to get to that point where they actually realize the value from their investments, and too many times they spend way too much money, too much time, and too much effort on the implementation than they should, and that's something to be aware of as you go forward with an S/4HANA deployment. Now, to be fair, it's not just the fact that S/4HANA is difficult and costly to deploy, it's also the fact that most organizations that choose to implement S/4HANA are larger, more complex organizations, which by definition is going to lead to a more risky or a more difficult ERP transformation regardless of what technology it is. So it's not entirely the fault of S/4HANA, but it is a larger complex product that typically costs more to implement and takes longer to realize the value. So that's something to be aware of as you're navigating your decision, or at the very least, if you've already committed to move forward with S/4HANA, you at least want to make sure you navigate it in a way that you're maximizing the value on your investment. So I hope this has helped paint a picture of what S/4HANA transformations can look like, what some of the risks and pitfalls are, and whether or not S/4HANA is right for your organization is really up to you and what your criteria and priorities are. And like I said before, at the very least, even if you do decide that S/4HANA is the best fit for you, it's very important to be aware of these risks, because these risks are what typically lead to higher cost, higher risk, more time to implement, and that sort of thing. So you just want to go into those eyes wide open and not have an overly optimistic view of what these transformations are going to entail. And to help you through your journey, I've also included a link below to our guide to an S/4HANA transformation. This guide gives you everything you need to know about how to be successful in deploying S/4HANA. I've also included a number of links below that might help you compare S/4HANA to other options in the marketplace. So I hope you found this information useful, and I hope you have a great day.